At this point, we can slow but not stop climate change, and so we're going to need to prepare for the changes that are coming and the changes that are happening. This panel is about 3 aspects of community in Indiana: the urban community, the agricultural community, and the wildlife that co-inhabit our state with us, the community of wildlife, how they are impacted by climate change, and some ways that we can help to mediate and bring solutions for climate change into the future. Our first speaker is Sheila Kennedy. Sheila has training and 20 years experience in landscape architecture, floodplain management, and sustainable lead design. She oversees stormwater, floodplain, and green infrastructure planning and policy projects for Christopher Burke Engineering. She will be speaking on Indiana's changing hydrology and using green infrastructure for flood mitigation and drought relief. So, Sheila, help me welcome Sheila to the podium.
Thank you. I'm the luckiest speaker because I get to speak after lunch. So stay with me. I saw there's cookies on the table, so indulge. And I'm going to try to keep the number of graphs and charts to a minimum, but I have to have some. Oh. Yeah. Let me figure this out first. Nope. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, back up. It's not backing up. Up? Okay. Okay, up, sorry. Okay. All right, so now that you've seen all my slides, my work here is done. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about resilience and green infrastructure. And, hello? It's working. Okay. So what is resilience, really? It is the ability to anticipate that there's some sort of risk. Maybe it's a flood, maybe it's a drought. You're going to limit the impact because you're prepared for it, and then you're going to be able to respond quickly. So let's say you look at the forecast, and there's going to be 2 or 3 inches of rain in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, and you know that you have natural systems in place, so you're comfortable that that's going to accommodate your rainwater, that runoff, and so you'll be able to bounce back quickly from that event. There's 2 different ways to look at resilience and put in strategies that have to do with adaptation as well as mitigation. Is it possible to see the slides here? No? Okay. Okay, so first adaptation is recognizing that a flood or a drought is going to occur and how you can reduce those vulnerabilities. The second is mitigation, and that's what projects you're going to put in place so you can address the causes of that problem. Okay, so a little bit of background information. So this is from the National Climate Assessment Report, the 3rd and the 4th edition from 2014 and 2018. And so a couple things to point out here on this one chart. Up the y-axis is the relative number of extreme events, so that's the percent. It goes from up to 40% to minus 40%. And then the decades are across the y-axis. Okay, so what I want to point out here is that up till 1960, 1958 or so, we saw a relatively increase in the percentage of extreme events. But from 1960 to 2012, we're seeing a large increase, about 40% increase. So we're getting more intense, more frequent flooding events, or more storms. And so this equates to about 3.5 inches of rain. I tried to put it in amount of rainfall because that's easier for everyone to understand rather than return intervals or occurrence or anything like that. So then we have on the next image the observed percent change, total annual precipitation. So this is the rainfall from our heaviest events, so that 1%. And as you can see throughout the nation, here in the Midwest, we've had a 42% increase in those large events. So everyone pretty much is in agreement, right? We're getting more rainfall, more intensity, more frequency of those events. Okay, so there's been several really great reports that have come out from the Indiana Climate Assessment. And so let's look at this middle graph first. Up the y-axis is the precipitation in inches. It goes from 28 to 56. And the x-axis has the dates. 1895 to 2015. So during that time, there's been about a 15% increase in precipitation. That equates to maybe, I think, about 5.6 inches or something like that overall. Now, if you, which is about half an inch per decade, I think. Now, if you look at that dotted red line, you can see that in the most recent years, there's been a pretty dramatic increase. And so now we're looking at maybe 1.3 inches per decade of additional rainfall. So, and you can see how in the state, the amount of rainfall that's fallen has varied depending on where you are. And then so what we're seeing for Indiana and what's projected based on the climate change assessment reports is that we're expecting more precipitation, and that precipitation is going to change. We're expecting to have less snowfall and more rainfall. So that will increase about 6 to 8%, which adds another couple inches of rainfall per year to our average annual total. We're going to have seasonal precipitation, so it's expected to increase 25% in the winter and 20% in the spring. So this is especially concerning because the ground may be frozen, and so that we'll have more runoff. And also the trees won't have any leaves on them, so they'll be dormant, so they won't be uptaking as much water, and then there won't be any leaves to intercept that rainfall. And then the storm intensity itself is supposed to increase. So we have a 42% intensity, so more frequency, more intensity, and different type of precipitation, so more rainfall. Okay, last graph, I promise. Okay, so this one's really important. So we have standards in place. All our municipalities all have standards in place, or they should, for the big storms, the 100-year storm, that 6-inch, 24-hour storm. But what about those smaller storms? These are the storms that form our channels, our stream channels, and they're having a pretty big impact because we're not regulating or controlling the runoff for those. So up the y-axis, we have flow, cubic feet per second, goes from 0 to 1,600, and across the x, the bottom axis, is the duration. So in the red line is pre-development, so before we altered the land use. The blue is the post-development, and so after land use conditions have changed. And so what we're seeing from a typical 2-year storm event is that we have peak discharge increasing, so we have more flow in the water, and that makes a lot of sense. And then what we have is that the water staying in the stream channel longer. So what it's causing is erosion and the stream to collapse on itself and not be able to hold all that water. So we're seeing from these smaller storms, we're seeing a pretty significant impact on our local waterways. Okay, that's it for the graphs, promise. All right, so now let's talk about traditional gray infrastructure, or traditional stormwater management. So how do we manage stormwater? It's a system of pipes, like storm inlets to pipes to ponds, and then discharge into the receiving streams. So this is very efficient. The problem with this, if anyone remembers the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle from grade school, is that we don't have infiltration anymore, and we don't have the water staying on the soil where it lands, and so we don't have that recharge of the groundwater. So when the reverse happens, when we do have less rainfall, we may go into a drought situation or have a water shortage. So very efficient system, but impacts our hydrologic cycle, and also can lead to increased in flooding, combined sewer overflows, and then also decreased water quality. Okay, so an alternative approach is green infrastructure. So this it uses those natural characteristics of the soil and vegetation to mimic the hydrologic cycle. It captures and treats the stormwater at the source. It allows for infiltration. It improves water quality. So there's infiltration, there's filtration through the soil, and then there's storage as well, right there where the stormwater falls or the rainwater falls. You can apply green infrastructure at lots of different levels, a regional level, a local level, or even on a specific site. So that's what I'm trying to really push today, is that this idea that green infrastructure isn't just the bioswales or the permeable pavement. It's even looking at big river systems and our riparian corridors. Okay, so let's talk about these. So low impact development It preserves the natural systems and hydrologic functions of the pre-development site. So this is big picture, looking at the whole river corridor, maybe the entire watershed. So what practices, what adaptation practices or strategies, or what mitigation strategies can we put in place for that? So some examples are flood resilience, integrating this into our planning codes, design standards, maybe our capital projects, not extending capital projects into flood-prone areas or known flood areas. We could preserve those natural beneficial function of the floodplain. So the floodplain is this tremendous interface between the river and the land. The biology is incredible, and it's a great place to clean up a lot of the water quality. Incentivize soil health. We talked about this a little bit this morning. So what can we do in the watershed to make sure that soil stays where it should stay and it doesn't end up in our waterways? Some mitigation strategies, looking at cluster development or open space development, so preserving those open spaces. And then reconnecting the river to the floodplain. So when you have those smaller storm events, when the river starts to downcut, it's no longer connected to the floodplain, so it can't flood and it can't replenish that important area. Okay, so better site design. These are different things we can do to minimize impervious cover. So impervious increases runoff. So what can we do to remove some of those drivers of impervious? How can we make our streets maybe more narrow, our parking lots smaller? All of those drivers that we have in our local codes that increase impervious. What can we do to protect and enhance those sensitive areas during construction? Make sure we're protecting those large stands of trees, those wetlands. Disconnecting impervious, and then another important one is restoring that compacted soil. So after a construction project is done, let's go back and till the soil. Let's open that soil back up. Let's drill down and let's let the water infiltrate again like it did prior to construction. And then the source control practice. These are the ones I think we think of most when we think about green infrastructure. So these are the engineering methods that really mimic those natural characteristics of the soil and the vegetation and for the hydrologic cycle. So we can adopt standards for channel protection volume. Channel protection volume would certainly help with the degradation of our local streams or smaller streams. We can have technical standards in place that show us how to build green infrastructure practices properly and how to maintain them in the long term. And then those mitigation practices to control that runoff volume and improve that water quality with these built green infrastructure practices. Okay, so how do we get there? Maybe at a state level, we develop climate change informed guidance and standards. So we know we're getting more precipitation, but more rainfall, and the rainfall itself has changed. It's more intense, it's more infrequent. So the codes that we're using now, or the guidelines or regulations we're using now at the state and local level aren't going to address what we're going to see in the future. The state needs to allow municipalities to adopt those higher standards so that they can do what they need to do locally. As a local government, develop and implement resiliency strategies, so all these different layers of green infrastructure, the regional, the local, and like looking at the entire watershed, and then those stream corridors. And then as planners and engineers, we need to translate this concept to practice. So in theory, it's all great to talk about. We need to get practices on the ground. We need everyone's help to make sure that when you're sitting on a plan commission, a city council, town council, that you're promoting these ideas and that you're requiring your developers and engineers to implement these as well. And then make sure that we integrate these resiliency strategies into all of our plans, policies, and all of our designs that we work on. All right. Thank you. Any questions?
So how do you consider environmental justice when you're preparing mitigation and adaptation techniques? Does that come in to your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because a lot of the older neighborhoods are in the floodplain. So what can we do to help them? Certain strategies we can put in place. There's one, you can mitigate the structures or elevate the structures, help retain the stormwater, maybe more in the watershed so it doesn't make its way to the floodplain. There's several different things we can do to help those communities.
All right. So here's our next one. There has been a movement toward developed nations such as the U.S. aiding developed nations in sustainable development. I don't know if this intersects with your work at all, but do you think the U.S. has an obligation to provide foreign aid in environmental sector?
I just know about the hydrologic cycle. Yeah. I'm gonna pass that question to someone who's way smarter than me. Which I could talk about the hydrologic cycle if you want me to. I do a diagram: rainfalls, infiltrates, runs off.
The next one is your thoughts on suburban development and loss of topsoil. I mean, does development bulldoze off the topsoil, or are we moving into preserving it?
Oh, these are tough questions. Okay, all right, good, that's a great question. So as part of what I was talking about is the way that we develop the land. So if there are sensitive areas or areas with good topsoil, making sure that gets put back in. Tilling the land after we've had all the heavy equipment go over to build the houses or building or whatever is being built, making sure we're restoring the infiltration capabilities of the soil post development. I think better development guidelines, more aware, the more that we get together as groups like this and we educate each other, and then also educate others in our community, those building, designing, just always moving the needle, right? Is that how the saying goes?
Please join me in thanking Sheila. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Bowling. She's a professor of agronomy at Purdue University. Her research addresses the sustainability of water and agriculture in the face of changing climate. She's one of the lead authors on the recent report, Indiana's Agriculture in a Changing Climate, and she's speaking today on that topic. Please join me in welcoming Laura Bowling.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give a disclaimer up front since you said a professor of agronomy. I am in the agronomy department, but I am also a hydrologist by training, before anyone asks me to consult on their crops. But I have learned quite a bit about agriculture in my 16 years at Purdue, and so today I would like to talk to you about climate change impacts to agriculture in this state. Okay, so to start with, despite the fact that driving around the Indiana landscape, we are dominated by corn and soybean acreage, I do want to acknowledge that agriculture in Indiana is more diverse than just corn and soybean, as we heard from Greg Gunthorpe this morning. So what I've learned in the process of putting together this report is that we are first in the country in duck production, second in eggs, who knew? Of course, soybean and corn, and then also in the top 10 for specialty crops like blueberries, melons, canning tomatoes, and mint. And so when we're looking at climate impacts to agriculture, we're looking across all of these sectors. For the interest of time today, though, I am not talking about impacts to livestock agriculture. So as we've already heard, Indiana is of course getting warmer and it's getting wetter. So my units are in metric, but we have over the last century, precipitation has increased by over 14 centimeters or over 5 inches. And considering that our annual precipitation is about 100 centimeters per year, that is a very significant increase in the amount of water we're receiving in the state on an annual basis. But numbers like this, our average annual increases, does little to tell us what that means. What is the actual impact to everyday people from these changes in climate? And so that was a lot of my motivating research is looking at how seasonal changes, how changes to precipitation, timing, and temperature interact to create changes in how we manage our land. And that was also a big driving force in the creation of the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment that was led by the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. Together, this series of reports brought together over 100 experts from 50 different organizations around Indiana in order to pull together climate change impacts on 10 different sectors of the Indiana economy, agriculture being one of them. Our results make use of projections from 10 different climate models and looking at 2 emission scenarios, so both a medium and a high rate of emissions leading into the future. So the results I'm going to be showing you today are largely based on an ensemble, so the mean of those 10 different climate models, looking at mid-century conditions, so comparing now to a period between 2040 and 2070. So let's get into some of the changes that we're seeing. First and foremost, one of the most straightforward is that our growing season is getting longer. And here the metric that I'm using is the date by which soil temperatures first rise to 10 degrees Celsius, or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is often used as an indicator when soils are getting ready to plant. It has already moved forward by about 10 days in the last 30 years, and we're projecting that by the mid-century, this first date, when soil temperatures are getting warm enough, will be about 10 to 12 days earlier. However, have to keep pointing, that does not necessarily mean that planting will occur earlier. Hopefully you can see that this tractor is maybe looking a little bit bogged down in that field, similar to the conditions that we saw this spring. A lot of that increase in moisture is happening in the winter and spring, which is making it difficult to access fields in the spring. When we've quantified sort of the number of days suitable for field work moving into the future, and the biggest message there is a great deal of variability. In some years, we're seeing that you can get into the fields much earlier, things will be drier, water will have drained out of the fields, but in the next year, we're looking at a very large reduction in the number of days suitable for field work so that farmers won't be able to get into their fields until much later, even though soils are warm. This also leads to a large increase in the amount of subsurface drainage that we see coming from our agricultural fields. I'm sure that most of you are aware that for large parts of the state, agriculture would not be possible without our artificial drainage practices. Networks of pipes under the fields that are helping to lower the high water table. So you can see for the mid part of the state, we're projecting a 29 to 47% increase in the volume of subsurface drainage with our current drainage intensity, so that's not additional installation of tile drains, from just March to May. And that, of course, has very big implications for water quality because that tends to be where a lot of our dissolved nutrients come from, is from that subsurface drainage water. So looking to how we can cope with some of these changes, certainly we've already heard some things about improving soil health, building up organic matter, improving infiltration and water holding capacity in the agricultural soils can help to some extent, and certainly having more green growing things on the field for a greater part of the year can help if we have cover crops or fall planted cereals that can take up water in the early spring. That will help to manage this water. Increasing our crop diversity, selecting plants that are more flood tolerant and disease resistant, so after planting they can better survive these higher moisture conditions in the spring will be beneficial. Unfortunately for our producers, increasing drainage infrastructure to remove water from fields more quickly is going to probably be an important coping mechanism. Of course, that has important water quality implications that we need to be prepared for, although I will leave it to Dr. Dunning to address another option, which would of course be to take some of these wet fields out of production and perhaps convert those to bird habitat. So I'll let you pick that one up. All right, moving on into the later part of the growing season, warm temperatures are certainly impacting our crops as well. What I'm showing here are observed impacts to corn yield associated with high nighttime temperatures in July. So this is looking at yield from the last decade, and the horizontal axis is looking at nighttime temperatures. What's going on here is that the plants are losing the signaling to stop respiring at night because it's too warm. So they photosynthesize during the day, they continue to accumulate sugars, but then they keep respiring overnight, and they start to use up the sugars that they stored during the day. So this is resulting in overall decreased yield because of this nighttime respiration. If we want to look at the combined impacts of both the changes in temperature and changes in moisture availability later in the growing season, then we need to use simulation models. And we've done that for corn, soybean, and wheat, and we're showing yield impacts on the order of 16 to 20% yield reduction relative to current conditions using current technology. And I've told this story around the state to a lot of farmer groups, and it's really difficult to have this conversation and to advance the slides. Oh, now I did too many. Oh, now I did way too many. I'm an impatient person if you haven't figured that out yet. I thought I was pointing up. Okay. Okay, stop. Okay, this is observed corn yield, U.S. corn yield for the last 150 years. And so this blue dot, these periods in the last 50 years, this is the reality that producers are facing. Corn yields have increased dramatically in the last 50 years at a rate of about 1.9 bushels per year. So corn yields are going up, and so the message that corn yields are going to go down in the near future is not one that makes sense. But it's very difficult to project into the future because we don't know what this technology trend will look like in the future. This has to do with improving seed technology, improving management practices that are resulting in higher yields. So what I've been trying to show is then our reduction in yield relative to yield potential. So the gray line is if we take that technology trend and assume for now that it would continue at the same rate into the future. And then the dots are showing our simulated yields, taking into account climate changes, showing that we can no longer achieve that yield potential. Corn yield is still projected to increase, but at a much lower rate than it has been. The other thing to notice is the increasing difference between the blue dots, which are irrigated yields, and orange dots, which are non-irrigated, showing the increasing benefit of supplemental irrigation moving into the future. Okay, I tried to be patient. All right, so what are some of the changes? This breeding to or selecting varieties that are less likely to have nighttime plant respiration is important for maintaining yields in the face of high nighttime temperatures. I didn't talk much about soybean, but certainly soybean and other plants that have C3 photosynthetic pathways have greater potential to take advantage of high CO2 in the atmosphere, but they are still impacted by high temperatures and lack of moisture. So we'll still have some decrease in yield, but we do have greater potential for double cropping in southern Indiana that would allow us to have more growing things on the field for more of the year. And then once again, improved soil health can help with these short dry periods by retaining more moisture in the field. But unfortunately, when we're looking at increased drying later in the growing season, supplemental irrigation becomes more desirable, although our current analysis shows that it does not pay for itself with current corn prices. So that will decrease the widespread adoption of irrigation. Okay, can I do it? All right, I'm going to run out of time, and I knew I would, but I do want to say something about winter conditions because I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the report. Perennials get complicated. They need cold but not freezing conditions during the winter. The date on which dormancy begins is moving later, so plants are going dormant later in the fall, which affects their ability to accumulate chilling hours in the winter. But what our perennials need, I said, are those cool hours. And so right now with our warmer winters, perennial plants actually accumulate chilling hours faster than they have in the past because they want hours between about 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. What that means is that our plants are breaking dormancy earlier in the spring. It's a pretty small change, but we're seeing this out in the landscape. Fruit trees bud out earlier, and this puts them at greater risk from frost damage. Going farther into the future, then we run the risk of not accumulating enough chilling hours, and so then we lose the ability to grow some cold hardy varieties in Indiana. So this early budding can result in more crop losses in our perennial fruit. So we need some cold hardy varieties that will be less responsive to winter warm periods. But on the plus side, we might be able to grow some fruits in Indiana that we cannot currently grow, but we might lose some winter hardy, some apple varieties that we tend to like. Okay, disease and weed pressure is a really difficult one to quantify because every one of these pests, weeds, bugs have different preferences, different habitats. But we do know that the combination of warmer winters, wetter springs, hotter summers is just ideal conditions for a lot of new invasive species. And the downside is that in the short term especially, producers are going to be turning to a greater reliance on pesticide application in order to manage pests that they've never seen before. And that's really true whether we're looking at organic systems or non-organic systems. So because of those increased applications, the costs associated with them, some types of fruit production in the state might just not be economically viable because it's going to be so much more expensive to manage those pests. We're talking many, many applications per year. So we certainly have, in the longer term, a need to develop integrated pest management approaches to address these emerging challenges, as well as selecting plants with increased insect and disease resistance. Okay. So I think I was asked at one point to talk about building up soil organic matter, and that's a pretty negative story because it is, of course, going to be harder to build up soil organic matter under these conditions. Increased spring rainfall means increased soil erosion, more overland flow, and so we're either putting in more tile drainage to move that water through the soil to prevent overland flow and erosion, or we're letting the water go over the surface, and it's taking the topsoil with it. Really wish I could be smart enough to figure this out. Okay, our soils will also be warmer, and soil decomposition happens at a faster rate. 20 degrees Celsius is about the ideal range. What I'm showing on the right is the seasonal distribution of soil temperatures, showing that we're going to be a couple degrees warmer in the winter, 5 to 6 degrees warmer in the summer, and that period of ideal soil decomposition rates is going to be longer. So losing more of our organic matter to convert to CO2 through that natural process. And then, of course, if we have reduced crop yield, that means that there's less residue, less biomass going back into the soil. So we have to try a lot harder to find other ways to get biomass into our soil by having green growing things on the field for more of the year. Have I made that point yet? I think maybe 3 times. All right. So coping with some of the changes to soil and water, I'm supposed to stop. There are approaches we can adopt, management practices that will improve overall soil quality, building our soil organic matter even as the temperatures warm, increasing plant diversity, getting more cover crops, winter wheat, things like that planted so we don't have bare soil conditions, reduced in no-till systems so that we're reducing the exposure of our soil to the atmosphere. However, things like that, things like no-till, do not necessarily help with our water quality problem because no-till systems can, in fact, improve the movement of dissolved nutrients into our tile drains. And so we also have to have separate mechanisms to address the water quality issue. So my illustration is showing a drainage water recycling system. So looking at ways that we can capture that subsurface drainage water or hold it in the fields or near the fields so that we can both reduce the excess water in the spring, but then maybe reuse that water in order to provide the source for supplemental irrigation later in the growing season. And I think with that, I will stop talking, and I'll just acknowledge the other members of our team. Thank you very much.
So we have a couple of questions for Dr. Bowling. First, do you have an opinion on hydroponic farming?
Sure. Do I have an opinion? I think it sounds great. We work with an EPICS team that's developing a hydroponics display. I think it's part of an overall solution for our food system and the ability to grow fresh local food and to have people, I see hydroponics really working in urban environments and giving people local choices in order to supplement their food supply.
Okay. And then we have another one about the climate modeling going on at Purdue. Do Purdue's climate model projections include severe winter weather events, such as polar vortex or other Arctic air masses? And what impact are those going to have?
The projections that we use for this type of analysis don't get into that fine scale extreme weather generation. There are other researchers who are doing many more detailed studies in terms of severe weather in looking at convective storms in particular. So yes, I can say not my area of expertise. Anecdotally, yes, they're expected to increase.
Okay. One more, would composting help with soil quality and water retention?
Absolutely. Right, it's another way of getting organic matter into your soil and improving the soil structure. Certainly there are good there are a lot of concerns about composting if you're talking about composting food waste and things like that, to make sure that you're not, if you're putting it on your own garden and being safe about it. But compost is a wonderful source of organic matter.
Great. And then I had a question also. You were talking about how there are different plant varieties that might hold up better, or crop varieties as our climate changes. Are we seeing farmers move to different crops yet? Is that started?
To some extent. There was actually, so obviously I'm in West Lafayette, there was just an article in the Journal and Courier this week about a farmer who was planting sorghum and did better in the wet conditions we had this spring. So to some extent, I think we heard a lot of comments this morning about our incentive system and our agricultural system. There are a lot of problems with market access for farmers to really diversify their crops and move away from corn and soybean. That's not what the infrastructure is set up for. So there are a lot of other impediments for people to diversify their crops.
Yeah, and that sounds like an opening for maybe policy change in the future. Please join me in thanking Dr. Bowling. Thanks so much. Yeah. Our third speaker is Dr. John Dunning, excuse me. Dr. Dunning is a professor of wildlife ecology at Purdue University. His research focuses on the impact of human-associated change in the landscape distribution and quality of habitat for native wildlife, with a primary focus on Midwestern bird populations, and he's going to speak on our wildlife communities in the face of climate change. Dr. Dunning.
Thank you. So I get to wrestle with this thing now. So I see a couple of familiar faces out there. I was asked to talk about wildlife and how it's going to be affected by climate change. Those of you who know me probably are expecting me to talk a lot about birds, and yes, that's actually what I'm going to do here. But I do have some other slides on how some non-bird things, but I mostly study birds. And in order to, here we go. I need to set a bit of context before we can talk about the impact of climate change on birds. Many of you may have seen headlines in our newspapers and other sources from a couple months ago that North America has lost billions of birds. And I wanted to at least mention a bit about this new study that was published in the journal Science in the beginning of October, because it does everything I'm going to say about how climate change affects birds. You have to keep what was in that paper in mind. So this is one of the figures out of the paper, and it's a pretty complex figure, but just let me point out that the figure over here is showing the change in North American bird populations if we set the number of birds we had up here in 1970 at 0. This is what we've seen through the present. We've lost, they estimate, I think it was 2.9 billion birds. Just we have that many fewer birds now in North America. This middle graph here is showing the same data, but just broken up by habitat types. So the biggest declines are in grassland birds here. Then we have the boreal forests across Canada and Alaska. Up here are our temperate forests. The figure over here with the bar grams just showing the same data. The further left you get of the midline, the zero line here means the biggest loss. And you can see for virtually all habitat types, we've had a 20% or more decrease in bird populations. The only thing really that's increasing are wetland birds, and I'll come back to that in a while. Here are some data from one of my PhD students who's going to be finishing up next semester. Jessica Outcalt has been looking at weather radar from here in Indiana as a way of estimating bird numbers. This is a sort of growing art using weather radar. She's finding the same thing. This is the weather radar that's up by South Bend and Fort Wayne. This is the radar that is in Indianapolis, and she's finding about a 4% decline per year in the number of migrating birds moving through Indiana. So same thing that we had in that big study we're seeing here in Indiana. What groups of birds are declining? It's the biggest group are sparrows, then warblers, then blackbirds. Oddly, next is house sparrows, which are not a native species, and most people don't like them, so maybe you're happy to hear that they're declining quite a bit. And then you get other groups. But if you start up here at 0 and work your way around the top dial, you end up with 3 billion birds disappearing. The smaller figure in blue, these are the groups that are increasing. The largest increases are seen in the group of birds called vireos. Here's a warbling vireo. I put this up here because most people don't know what a vireo looks like. That's a vireo. The authors had no explanation for why vireos are increasing. The next group is ducks and geese, so that's part of those wetland birds that are increasing. So just tons of birds groups are in decline. The reason I start off with this as my context is that this does not include the effect of climate change very much. Climate change probably has had an impact. You've seen slides like this already. We have had changes in our climate, but the projections are that these changes are going to continue and become much more dramatic. So if we talk about what birds or what wildlife in general are going to be harmed by climate change, we have to realize that we've already lost huge numbers of our wildlife due to other factors, probably due a little bit to climate change, but any losses that I'm going to talk about from now on about climate change are on top of the losses that we've already seen. And that makes it even more of a concern for those of us who study wildlife. So I don't think I have the next slide in there. I think it's later, but we need to be figuring out what we should be doing to save wildlife habitat for both the short-term period here when the projections of how our climate might be changing more or less sort of overlap, but also the longer-term period when the different models of large amounts of emissions versus smaller amounts of emissions sort of diverge. We need to figure out strategies for both of these time periods. So what are causing this, the decline so far? It's not hippos, okay? But for years I've been using hippo as a good memory device for my students to understand what are the things that are causing wildlife populations to decline. So the primary thing so far is hippos, apparently. There we go. Habitat loss and fragmentation. By far the biggest factor causing declines in our native wildlife is habitat loss. Then after that, depending upon the group you're talking about, it's invasive species, pollution issues, human overpopulation, and overexploitation or overhunting. Here in the United States, that last part is primarily with marine fisheries or other kinds of fisheries. We're still overfishing quite a bit to gather the fish that we eat. So that's where hippo comes in. But the problem is, whoops. Well, you saw it real fast there. The problem is what I've been teaching for years doesn't include climate change. And now we're thinking that climate change is probably going to be worse than any of the problems other than maybe habitat loss. So that's the destruction of a really good mnemonic, because you put a C in there, you can't remember hippo anymore. But just emphasizing what we've been talking about in the past, which is habitat loss, invasive species, and pollution, sort of ignoring, well, the hippo in the room, I guess, not the elephant. So I'm going to skip over this slide. I want to show you now some projections of how we use climate change models into figuring out what bird species or other wildlife species are going to be declining in the future due to climate change. And this slide was in here just to kind of explain how this science is done. I can talk about that in the question period if we want. But there's a really good resource from the Forest Service down here, their atlasing projects. They've actually looked at current ranges of both North American trees and North American bird species. The bird species data is based on large efforts to survey our birds, like the breeding bird surveys and Christmas bird counts and that sort of thing. This is showing breeding data here. And then they use climate change models to project into the future where the birds might be, assuming that they need the same climate associations that they see now. So this is a common bird that we have here over most of Indiana, the eastern phoebe. This is where it's found now. You don't really need to see the legend very much, just realize the bright areas are where the birds are most common. So the pinkish areas here are where you're going to have an 80 to 100% chance of seeing a phoebe if you're in the right habitat at the right time of year. This is what the phoebe's range and abundance is going to look like by the end of the century, according to the climate change models. This is modeling high emissions. That's just business as usual emission levels. And you can see that the pink and most of the red areas have disappeared. Phoebes are still going to be found most of the same range, but here in Indiana, they will not be anywhere near as common. You'll have a 50% or less chance of seeing them, which is a big drop, especially from southern Indiana, where they are currently abundant. So that's an example of these kinds of comparisons we can do with the Forest Service data. So that's the same slide. And now we're playing with each other. Okay. I'm not going to go over all these numbers. I just want you to look at the bottom here in the interest of time. Looking at the subset of the Forest Service models that have good data, what we find is of the species that are going to change, 70% of them are going to decrease. Of our common forest, grassland, wetland birds, 70% of them are projected to decrease due to climate change. 30% of them are going to increase. That's one of the sort of take-home messages from this talk is there's always winners and losers. Anytime you have a kind of change, there's always going to be some things that will respond well, some things that will respond poorly. But the take-home is that what we think we understand now is that more species are going to decline than increase. What species are going to greatly decrease? Many of our really, really common birds, wood thrushes in our forests, house wrens and catbirds. I have both of those in my backyard. The map here is of rose-breasted grosbeak, which is a really beautiful forest bird found mostly in the northern part of the state. Its range sort of peters out here in Indianapolis, and we have fewer breeders in the southern part of the state. By the end of the century, the Forest Service Atlasing Project suggests we'll have a 20% or less chance of seeing a rose-breasted grosbeak when we get into the right habitat anywhere in the state. So that's a big decrease. All right. More species that'll decline. Baltimore orioles, orchard orioles, song sparrows, chipping sparrows, larks. You can see the whole list here. And the main thing I want to point out is that none of these species are currently thought to be rare or threatened or endangered. They're not on anybody's real radar screen in terms of what we're managing for. These are our common birds that are disappearing. What species are projected to disappear entirely from the state? The maps here are for bobolink, which is this really beautiful and weird little grassland specialist. It's a relative of red-winged blackbirds. You can see where it's currently found is in the northern part of the state in the Great Lakes. It's projected to completely disappear from Indiana. just due to changes in the climate. Blue-winged warbler, Savannah sparrow, Canada goose. So that may make some of you say, good. But that's actually a low-quality model. I don't know that we should trust. I don't even think the Forest Service trusts that particular data set, but I just threw that in more or less for comic relief. There will always be winners and losers. Here are some of the winners. These are species that will increase. Most of them have a range like you see here. The current range for prothonotary warbler, which is this guy up here. These are southeastern species that will increase northward for the most part. So blue grosbeaks, mockingbirds, summer tanagers. And here's the good news for the bird watchers in the group. There are only 2 species that are projected to move into the state due to climate change that we don't currently have as breeders. One of them is cattle egret, which is a really weird species. I wouldn't trust that at all. But we get painted bunnings. And painted bunnings are this really gorgeous bird here. The French name for it is non-parallel. They're mostly found in Texas and Louisiana. And they become, so if you like painted bunnings, okay. But most of the rest of our birds are declining. Other species, same kind of pattern. So one of the cold water fish that are native to Indiana is the Cisco. At the turn of the 20th century, we had 45 lakes that had Cisco. We now have 6. Why are they declining? Hello? I think it's how long I'm pointing to. The main problem for Ciscos is they're a cold water fish, and so they are found in the bottoms of the lakes. And the problem we have there is that nutrients coming off of our land go into the water. They feed algal blooms. The algae die, feed bacteria in the bottoms, and that creates dead zones called hypoxia. And that is projected to increase tremendously with climate change, because you have increased air temperatures, you have increased runoff. The combination of those 2 things are going to create bigger hypoxic zones, and that will eliminate the habitat for the Cisco. For amphibians, the 2 big issues there are they need wetlands for breeding. They need wetlands that don't have fish. As we become hotter, temporary wetlands like vernal pools dry down faster. Tadpoles don't have enough time to metamorphize. You lose your amphibian populations. If you have more flooding, as was talked about earlier, then the areas that currently don't have fish end up with fish in them. Fish eat the eggs. You don't end up with amphibian populations. I'm not going to talk about the impacts on the reptiles and mammals due to time. Let me just go to, hopefully, a few suggestions of what we need to do. So there's our swamp rabbit. Come on. We need to both adapt and mitigate, as we were talking about before. What can we do? First thing, the fact that the wetlands birds are increasing, that's the one group of birds that we've been managing for, one group of habitats we've been managing for, because hunters pay taxes that go to protect wetland habitats so that they have places to hunt. So that shows that if we put our attention to it in time and money, we can increase bird populations in spite of all these things. We just need to have the political willpower to do it with things other than just wetlands. So what else do we need? We need to, I was going to say, vote for people who give a hoot. But that seemed kind of cheesy, so I just have care. We need to protect the areas that are most important, and we need to project where new habitat for things like bobolinks and the swamp rabbit are going to be. Let's see if I can get back to the, yeah. Okay, this is one of Jessica's figures. And so this is Indianapolis right here. The red areas are places where migratory birds are really common. This is a weather radar images. This is not the map of habitats. Those are birds coming out of coming off the land at the start of their migration flight just at sundown. So the places that are really red are places where we have tons and tons of birds coming out. So this is Morgan Monroe and Yellowwood State Forest. There's Lake Monroe right there. So this is places that we know to preserve big patches of forest. See this little hook right there? That's the Big Walnut Preserve owned by the Nature Conservancy. That is not a place that a lot of birders seem to have access to because there's almost no checklist in eBird comparing Big Walnut Creek to, say, Eagle Creek Park, but there's tons of migrants coming out here. The other thing I want to point out here, what's that? Well, that's where we are right now. Okay, these are the North Indiana suburbs, and there's lots of birds coming out of these areas, Carmel, Avon, that sort of thing, where there's very few coming out from other areas. So what is it about these neighborhoods that shelter more migratory birds during the spring and the fall? That's part of what Jessica is studying right now to see if she can make recommendations of how we structure our habitats. And I know I'm way out of time, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dunning. We had a couple of really good questions come in. Is the habitat loss primarily in the summer or winter range?
So all these maps that I was showing you are breeding populations. Habitat loss is a serious issue in the summer, in the winter, and the more recent focus has been what we call stopover habitat, which is what migratory birds need during migration itself. It's all three parts. The species that are declining the most of migratory species are the ones that are seeing habitat loss in all three areas.
Thank you. And then just a minute ago, Dr. Bowling predicted that we may have farmers increasing their use of pesticides. Is that going to have an impact on our wildlife?
We don't know, but there have been a couple of recent studies, some here in the United States and especially more in Europe, pointing to the newish group of insecticides called neonicotinoids. Did I get that? I can never pronounce that right. They may be playing a bigger role in reduction of bird populations than we were aware of before. I will say one thing about the interaction between our birds and agriculture. No, I won't go there. Take too long.
Okay. And then sort of a modification on that last question, would the prediction of the greater need for pesticides impact hypoxic conditions in the lakes?
I don't know. I haven't seen anything written about how pesticides coming off the land into our ponds and lakes have any impact on hypoxia. I haven't seen that discussed.
Thank you. And then one feedback loop that will accelerate wildlife loss that doesn't often get attention is that humanity is losing its connection to nature. More and more of us are urban dwellers, and so do you have any thoughts on how we change that, and what are the best solutions to pull people out of their virtual worlds and reconnect them to nature?
So that's a great question. I'll ask you all to come back here next Saturday. I'm teaching a conservation biology class right now, and this coming week we're going to be talking all 3 days about environmental education. So I'll know a whole lot more than I do right now, apparently. But I will point out one thing. How many people know about Pokemon Go? Okay, Pokemon Go. You run outside and try to use your phone to capture these imaginary things that are all sorts of cool stuff that you can find scattered in various places throughout the environment in which you live. There are some of those who wish that we would have thought of that and just actually populate the thing with the real stuff that we have out there, which is as exciting as, anyway. One of my former students is one of the naturalists at Eagle Creek Park, and what she reports is that the grade school kids that come to the nature center there know all about poison dart frogs, but they're totally unaware of the fact that there are bullfrogs here in Indiana. So it's a huge disconnect. I absolutely disagree.
So, yeah, please join me in thanking Dr. Dunning. Yeah. We have a couple of minutes left with this panel to sort of address a few additional questions. And I wanted to direct one question to my colleague, Tim Maloney, who's joining us at the table. I mean, we've heard a lot about climate change impacting our urban, agricultural, and wildlife communities. Is anything going to happen at the State House that might help any of these issues?
Well, as many of you know, one of the policy priorities for HEC and a lot of our conservation partners is increasing state investment in habitat protection, buying more public lands, more forests, more wetlands, more grasslands, protecting more stream corridors. And that's something that Indiana has just not kept pace with a lot of other states. And so we will continue to be working principally during budget sessions to increase Indiana's investment in habitat conservation.
There is a bill at the federal level that has a huge implication for the states, and that's the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA. And if this passes, and there's I don't know, slight chance, because the bill has Republican sponsors in both the House and the Senate. The figures I've seen is that it would provide $8 billion for wildlife conservation here in the state of Indiana, which is equal to something like all the money that we've put in from state wildlife grants and that sort of thing over the last decade or so. And it would be $8 billion a year. So that would be a huge amount. But Indiana is going to have to produce a matching amount, not $8 billion, but there is a match requirement. And all the money that we spend on the DNR budget wouldn't be enough to match what we could potentially get, wouldn't provide enough match for what we would potentially get. So if the Recovering America's Wildlife Act moves closer, we're going to have a really serious discussion about how do we come up with the state's match to be able to capture those federal dollars.
And then, did you have anything to add on State House kinds of things? One of the things our legislators did in 2019 was to establish a stormwater task force. One of the recommendations that came out of the stormwater task force was that stormwater infrastructure should be studied in the state, including costs of stormwater infrastructure. Any recommendations as the legislature goes into a possible bill about that? I mean, maybe Sheila, that would be for you.
Sure. I think a summary report just came out or is on its way out. So this group talked a lot about studying water at a watershed level, which is absolutely perfect. I mean, where better can you study the flow of water than within the bowl that it falls? Protecting those floodplains, I think that was discussed a lot. Big regional studies, especially the Maumee River Basin, Kankakee River Basin, I think there's 5 big basins in the state. Those organizations and how they manage agricultural drainage as well as urban drainage within those basins. So I think there's good precedence there. So I hopefully those get implemented.
Great. So please join me in thanking our panelists. This was a wonderful discussion.